Is Luke Rains. I've had the privilege of teaching U.S. history here in our school to the high schoolers this past year. This is my first year doing it, so I'm kind of a rookie, but I've been amazed at how many different instances God's hand has been evident throughout the history of our country. Our founding fathers had a fear of God. Many people throughout our history have known God personally, have feared Him, and there's been several instances of God's providence throughout the foundation of our history and even up to this day. One in particular that I would like to talk about today is something that occurred in World War II. Just recently, my students and I have been going over World War II, and there's so many battles, so many famous sayings and people in World War II, but I just want to pull out one instance of God's providence in World War II, and it happened in the Pacific Theater just prior to the Battle of Midway. Midway was an island in the Pacific Ocean, midway between Hawaii and Japan. And America's strategy was to take over these islands that Japan was using as naval fortresses. And one of those islands was Midway. And the Japanese fleet was a very threatening fleet for the Navy. And in fact, American forces were having a hard time defeating the Japanese Navy. And there was one instance, I think it was June 4th of 1942, that the naval squadron led by John Waldron was flying at a lower altitude to try to discover where the Japanese fleet was. And the Japanese fleet had actually turned course, and let me back up and say that the Americans had actually intercepted the code for the Japanese plans. And so they were aware of a lot of things that the Japanese were doing. However, the strength of the Japanese fleet was almost insurmountable without knowing ahead of time how to defeat them. Well, the Japanese fleet had changed their course, and this dive bombing squad led by John Waldron was trying to find this Japanese fleet. And because of the low cloud cover, they had to fly at an even lower altitude, which obviously made them more susceptible. Well, they came upon the Japanese fleet and got into an air raid with them. And I believe all of the planes in that squadron were defeated by the Japanese. It did take a toll on the Japanese fleet, and one providential thing that happened was not the killing of that squadron, but little did they know, about an hour later, another squadron would be flying at a higher altitude, trying to accomplish the same mission as Waldron's squadron. And after this air raid that they had, the Japanese planes had gone back to their carriers, were refueling, rearming, and that in that amount of time, that other American squadron that was coming at a higher altitude found a break in the clouds. And they didn't know where the Japanese fleet was, but it was almost as if God had pulled back the clouds for them to see the wakes of the Japanese fleet. And they were able to descend and catch the Japanese army right while they were refueling and rearming their planes from the previous attack with Commander Waldron's squadron. And so they were completely vulnerable, didn't have the equipment necessary to even defend themselves. And within a matter of 5 minutes, there were 3 carriers, Japanese carriers, that were destroyed. There were several airplanes, and many historians look at that as a turning point, specifically in the Pacific theater of World War II. Now, you could look at an instance like that and say, well, that's just circumstances, that's just coincidence. But given the nature of our country and even many of those World War II veterans who sought God, who prayed for God's protection, for God's wisdom and direction, I would challenge you to consider that this was an act of God's providence, looking out for those that were in a cause for freedom, in a cause for liberty, and in a cause for upholding the freedoms that God has endowed us by as our Creator. And so I would just challenge you to think about, reflect upon God's providence throughout our history, not just at the beginning, but all throughout the course of history, how God intervenes in the affairs of men. And God uses men in his plan, and he can control the weather, he can control the thoughts of men and the words of men, and every action God is in control of. And we look at these instances that are miraculous, how if one thing would have been different, the outcome of the war might have been different itself. But we look at it and see God is providentially governing in the affairs of men.